In this video, I'm going to cover 5 reasons why the 1980s had so many world records in athletics, and why after 30 years, we're just now starting to see new world records being broken. Hey, I'm John from Jumpers Junction. I'm an athlete and coach in track and field. And in this channel, it's all about tips, tricks, and analysis that I wish I knew 10 years ago. Have you ever wondered why track and field has so many world records that were all set back in the late 80s and early 90s, and they're all still standing today? I always wondered that, and so I did a little digging, and in this video, I'm going to discuss a few observations or patterns that hopefully might give us a little insight. Because while training programs, recovery, nutrition, sports science, technology, it's all improved drastically in the last 30 years, there's still this disconnect. So let's take a look at why. Number 5, ease of access. All right, so the first thing I'll point out is that track and field kind of is an amateur sport. Track was governed originally by the Amateur Athletic Union, AAU, or the International Amateur Athletic Federation, IAAF, which is now World Athletic. There's this whole focus or emphasis on amateurs. It really wasn't until the late 1980s that track kind of shifted away from amateur to a more professional sport. But in many ways, this is kind of just the title of a pro. I mean, it's pretty much all up on you to do all the aspects that come with being a professional athlete. And believe me, it's expensive and challenging, especially logistically, to get access and funds to all of the training, coaching, dietary and nutritional needs, medical facilities, medical work, all these things that are provided to you and provided for you in a team environment or in a university. If you think about back in the 1980s, that was the heat of the Cold War, and many of these Soviet bloc countries, they had state-sponsored programs where athletes literally trained full-time in a team environment as professional athletes. Now I'll get more on that in a little bit, but first we have to move to number 4, the money. Today, most professional athletes make very little money from sport track and field, and the majority of them, they've got regular jobs. I mean, if you look at the 2022 World Championships, the winner receives $70,000 US. It's not bad, but in 8th place, they received $5,000. This is the Super Bowl equivalent meet in track and field, and the winner, the 8th best person in a world of almost 8 billion people, received only $5,000. Compared to other sports, that's absolutely chump change. And so there's a whole nother conversation about why there's less funds available. The point is that there's really not a lot of money to be made from the actual winnings nowadays. And sponsorships, endorsements, which pretty much is just from shoe companies, and leave a little asterisk on that, they're not quite as lucrative as you would think. And when you consider that top athletes, especially growing up today, LeBron James, the Patrick Mahomes, Aaron Judge, even Usain Bolt, they all played multiple different sports as a kid. And so it's hard to deny that for most kids, the money flowing into these other more popular sports, it's a huge draw away from track and field. And with the rise of television and the televised sports, money just started pouring into all these other sports, which pretty much largely left track and field behind in a really tough position. Because only the die-hard track fans are going to sit around for 9 hours at 3 a.m. to watch a full meet being held across the world in Switzerland. I'm that guy, but it's really hard to even find how to watch track and field nowadays. That being said, the lack of financial compensation being a mental motivator, it really can't be ignored. This leads me into number 3, level of competition and a cultural mindset. If you think about Jamaica, in recent years, a country with a population less than 3 million people, but yet they're one of the top most dominant countries in producing track and field athletes in short sprints and jumping. This kind of contradicts that popular opinion that sheer volume will produce greater competition, right? Because Jamaica is far less people, but yet track and field is one of the most popular sports. So it kind of makes a popular choice for young athletes. And then you have athletes like Shelly Ann Fraser, Usain Bolt. These are major sport icons, not just in Jamaica, but globally. So you can't help but think that there's a cultural mindset that could play a factor. And now if we think about the geopolitical situation, back in the 1980s, you had the United States and West Germany, the Soviet Union and East Germany, they were all trying to showcase their political dominance. And one way to show an ideological superiority was through sports, and which country had the best athletes. National pride may have bled into this culturally motivated athletic advantage. And this kind of holds true today. I mean, Kenya has a long history of producing elite distance runners. Cuba, long history of producing long and triple jumpers. So if you're a kid growing up in one of those countries, the athletic advantage might literally just be national pride or access to training or resources that benefit the specific sports history. Now, that being said, we move to number 2, which I'm guessing many of you already have been thinking about. And that is that back in the 80s, they were all jacked up on steroids and testosterone. All right, let's take a look. The modernized anti-doping policies we see today, it kind of started to develop at the end of the late 80s and into the early 1990s. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, basically it exposed this whole state-sponsored doping program, specifically targeting East German female athletes. These were basically kids picked up from a young age, and many times not even aware of it, they were given testosterone and anabolic steroids. It was terrible. If you think about globally, back then, many athletes in many countries were likely using some form of enhanced substances to improve their performance. Because the rules, testing procedures, they were minimal. And now, while drug testing was common as early as the 1960s, and even earlier, it was just less robust, athletes pretty much knew ahead of time when they would be tested. It really wasn't until the late 80s that the optics started to change. A very publicized steroid-related disqualification occurred at the 1988 Seoul Olympics. There was a Canadian sprinter, his name was Ben Johnson. He won the men's 100 meters, but afterwards he tested positive for stanzol, and he was stripped of that gold medal. Well, sure enough, in 1989, less than a year later, they started actually doing randomized drug tests. And then in the late 1990s, the IOC and the IAAF, World Athletics, they took a more organized approach against doping, and that kind of led to the formation of the World Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA, in 1999. Now, you'd think that would maybe put a stop to doping. It didn't, but it likely became pretty eye-opening for many athletes. Now, just looking at the chart of women's world record count per year, you can see that the number of times a new world record was broken each year after the implementation of randomized drug testing, it pretty much flatlines. I mean, there are this section of records in the 90s and 2000s, but these are pretty much just from a few events. And if we look at what events they are, these are new field events that were introduced to women's athletics. So they're new sports, so it makes sense that there'd be this rapid increase in performance in new events as they were introduced. Now, something you can also take away is, as many of you know, if you want to be the best, you got to play with the best. Well, juiced up athletes competing at a higher level likely collectively raise the overall competition of all the other athletes, whether they're juiced or not. And this leads me to number 1. We may be reaching the physiological limit of what the human body is naturally capable of. I mean, it's common sense that physics can't be ignored. A human's not going to go run at the speed of sound, right? We know that there is an upper physical limit. Now, there have been many studies to predict the maximum running speeds of different animals based on their physiology and mechanics of movement. And in a 2008 study from Stanford University, biologist Mark Denny attempted to determine if there actually is an upper limit to which animals can run. So they looked at records of 3 racing sports that have a long history of records: track and field, horse racing, and English greyhound racing. Now, they plotted these times starting in the early 1900s, and they controlled for population growth, and they determined that there actually might be an upper limit to how fast a specific species can run at a specific distance. So looking at the graph, now as the men seem to have continued through the years at these gradual steps, on the women's side, the times have pretty much plateaued since the late 80s. And so there's a few things to consider. We know that in the 1980s, it was riddled with PEDs, performance-enhancing drugs. So we can try to account for this and remove those data points. However, there still seems to show a plateau supporting the analysis. So did PEDs accelerate our progress towards our natural physical limit? A limit that we would have inevitably achieved, just more gradually? Now, the author has an interesting point on this. He says, if performance-enhancing drugs are still being used by women, the effect of the drug itself has essentially reached an apparent plateau. And if you look at the chart, in 1989, that's when they started implementing these randomized drug testing. And there's a sharp drop-off in new records being broken. So with a relative hiatus in the women's sprints and running events, for much of the 90s and 2000s, it kind of does make sense and hint that we are approaching our limit. But what's interesting is what we're seeing in recent years. We've seen new records recently, specifically in the hurdles and longer distance events, and these are massive improvements too. Why? Well, assuming that we're not entering into a new wave of PEDs, It may be because we're seeing a massive improvement in PESs, or performance enhancing systems. This is our training programs, our optimized recovery and nutrition, major leaps in sports science and technology. We're seeing track surfaces designed to have more spring, shoes to help run faster and longer. We're seeing pacing lights on the track to help accurately keep pace, performance watches and monitors to produce huge amounts of big data, all engineered to make us better. And so it makes sense that we're seeing recent improvements in the more technical sprints and endurance events first. We may have pushed our body closer to our physical limits before, or at least accelerated that process, but we did so in a way that was unsustainable. But in a more complex event like hurdles, where you have a whole number of variables that can contribute to our success, we will likely continue to see new records, and likely in all events as we continue to push this athletic boundary. But I have a bonus for you of what's next. You may have read a book or watched a movie about The Chosen, a character whose destiny was set from the beginning of time for a specific purpose. You can't rule out the idea of generational athletes. People with a genetic advantage that, when coupled with the correct circumstances, produces a never-before-seen achievement. These are the PEGs, performance enhancing genetics. I know I keep making up acronyms, bear with me. These are athletes like Eero Mäntyjarä, a Finnish skiing legend who had a gene that allowed him to store or carry greater oxygen levels in his blood. You had Dean Karnazes, an ultramarathon runner who ran 350 miles in 80 hours because his genetics allowed his body to rapidly flush lactic acid. So now, and in the future, with advancing medical technologies, understanding your own genetic code and focusing on a sport or skill that would complement that, it could be the next phase in our physiological evolution. And if you enjoyed this, help the algorithm push it out to more people by commenting, and also leave a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.